Welcome to the Movement Upgraded podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Jen Hostler, licensed physical therapist and certified strength and mobility coach. Here you can expect to hear about all things movement. The Movement Upgraded podcast is a blend of the science of strength training, rehab, and mobility, mixed with the personal and professional experience to provide you with the steps you need to keep your body pain-free and moving well, so you can do what you love forever. Welcome back to the podcast. We have Dr. Ryan here again. I've been bringing him on a lot lately. Lucky you guys, huh?
I should just be the co-host.
Yeah, I mean, Ryan kind of is like the unofficial co-host of the podcast.
Yeah, but this podcast is literally Dr. Jen Hostler's podcast.
I think being a co-host is too much of a commitment for Ryan. He doesn't love doing these types of things.
Put words in my own mouth.
Well, would you disagree?
Oh, I'm here. I love this. This is a quality time.
This is how we spend our quality time. Yeah, no.
Yeah, I'd rather not be doing this as quality time, but, here we are.
I like it, but, whatever. So anyways, side note, from all of that, today's episode, we're going to talk about something that I think this was a request that I got on Instagram. It was really, honestly, a great request because this is something that I'm sure a lot of people have been confused about or would like a little bit more clarity about. And so we're going to chat about it. It's going to be a little bit brain intensive, which is why Ryan said this is a Dr. Jen episode. Because we're going to talk about...
I said this is a Dr. Jen podcast.
Oh, did you?
The whole podcast.
The whole podcast.
The whole podcast is... You have the whole intro and everything to this podcast.
That's true, it is.
Yeah,
I would have to change all of that if you became the co-host. But...
Oh, I know. I could do an amazing intro.
Could you?
No, people would be so turned off. They wouldn't even have made it this far. They would have turned the podcast off after the intro.
You sound like David Letterman. You gotta give yourself more credit.
Well, he's a pretty famous guy, so maybe I'm gonna become famous.
I don't know. You'd have to grow a beard like him. We just finished watching David Letterman.
He didn't always have a beard.
Yeah, I know, but when he did all of these, there's a Netflix special of him interviewing a bunch of famous or really I don't know, successful people in their fields, and it was very interesting to watch. But he had a lot of self-berating humor, and Ryan just kind of doing that. Anyways,
I think that we could have a really fun and entertaining pod. I would be really good with a fun and entertaining podcast.
I'm trying to get to the serious
not
part.
This whole episode on tissue remodeling, come on.
Maybe Ryan will make tissue remodeling more fun. Make anatomy fun again. Make science fun again.
Maybe you should just let me know if I need to create my own entertaining podcast.
I feel like
maybe we could retire off of this.
This is a ridiculous intro to a podcast because we haven't even said what we're talking about
They're
really
probably
today.
Loving it though.
Okay, we're
now
talking
on the tissue remodeling.
about tissue remodeling, which I think the question that somebody had asked was something around tissue training or retraining. And I just realized that at some point I probably need to explain what I mean when I say things like tissues and tissue remodeling. So yeah, this is going to be science heavy. Ryan's going to try to make it a little more entertaining for you because he hates boring things anyways and struggled with school so much. He would fall asleep in classes a lot, actually. I know that because I took some classes with him in undergrad and he would fall asleep.
But I'm not dumb. That just made me sound so stupid.
I know you're not dumb. You still graduated. This is actually,
I'm still a doctor.
This is the skill that Ryan has that nobody knows, is that he is can get the same amount of work done as a lot of people, but with way less, not effort, but way more efficiency. So he probably studied a quarter of the amount his classmates did and fell asleep in some classes, but would still ace the tests. Or maybe not ace them, but pass them. Just depended on what the topic was. Because if Ryan hates the topic, he will struggle to study it, even care about it. But if it's really interesting to him, he will go all in. So this episode, he hates this type of content, I think.
The application of it, the movement stuff, the exercise stuff, I love it. But the
science,
sciencey stuff, I know enough of it to like help people, but
explaining it is a different story.
Yeah, I don't really care. Nobody cares.
Yes, they do. Are doing this podcast. People request it.
Nobody cares.
People do care. I care. So my people. Oh my gosh, this is so loud. Sorry. My people care. The people that I work with are very much like me, and that like we love learning the why. Like, when you listen to this podcast episode, afterwards, you're going to do your Pales Rails, because I know you're doing them already. And you're going to be like, wow, I am remodeling these tissues and I'm doing this, blah, 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 my fibroblasts. Like, I want you to be able to think that, because for me, that's like that's how I get myself to do my mobility stuff. Ryan just isn't that way. I don't know.
It works, so I do it.
Yeah.
And I feel better when I do it.
Ryan is a man of like simple terms and like simple words. So for every like 300 words that I say, he says one. And so that's just like how it is. So 5 minutes in, we're going to finally talk about what tissue remodeling is. So let's talk about the tissues. I brought Ryan on here, by the way, for a little bit of making this less terrible of boring science, but also because sometimes I get lost in these deeper concepts, and I don't want to do that today. And so that's why he's here to kind of like navigate and make sure that we don't get lost. Because if Ryan's going to get lost and bored, then so are you, and that's not beneficial. I want you to get what you need out of this podcast.
And we wanted to make a 2-minute episode turn into 30 minutes because tissues remodel and they adapt to the forces you put into them. End episode. Bye.
No. They don't even know what a tissue is.
A muscle.
No, it's not a muscle.
Tendon, a ligament, a bone. All of the things, an organ.
One of the reasons that I wanted to make this episode is because I use the words tissues a lot instead of saying muscles. And for most people who are not familiar with anything in the body or very familiar with like superficial fitness type of thing, they don't have like a lot of physiology and anatomy background, they're like, we all just kind of think about muscles. We're very into muscles. Like, that's kind of it. It's a very baseline understanding of what we're doing when we exercise and what we're focusing and targeting. But when we're exercising, even in any exercise you do, like even squatting, you're not just loading your muscles. You are loading all of your tissues. So tissues, for the purposes of when I say things, we are going to be talking about like all of your connective tissues. So your muscles, right? But there's also fascia that encases all of everything. There is also ligaments. There are tendons. There's bone. There's articular cartilage. There's all kinds of tissues in your body. We are loading all of them. We cannot just load only one. We can change the parameters and how we do things to make sure that like some parts of them are getting loaded a little bit more. But it's not as specific as we think we're being so far in the research. That's what it shows. But it's really important to understand that, because I feel like we just kind of think muscles are it, and that's the only thing. And I remember even in PT school talking about wrists, and if we had any wrist injuries, I remember the wrist and hands. I probably have told this story already. I don't remember, but I'm gonna say it in case you haven't listened. Yeah, I know you have. In case we haven't, in case we haven't covered it or you haven't listened to those. But if you have a wrist injury, they were like, well, the only thing that covers the wrist is really tendons. There's no muscles there, so you can't really strengthen it. But then they would tell us what to do for wrist rehab, and it was always wrist strengthening exercises or sometimes a stretch. And that was really interesting to me because it seemed really contradictory in the way that they explained it, but then the application of things. And this is a perfect example of how a lot of PT school was for me, probably a lot of chiro school was for you. It seemed like the things that they were recommending and saying were contradicting the application of what they were doing. And I didn't like that, but that's also the case in a lot of rehab in general too, with physical therapy. So when it comes to tissues, you can strengthen and get those tissues to change and adapt and become healthier, stronger, more flexible, healthy tissues, or they can become stiff and weak and less flexible and more prone to injuries based off of things that happen in our lives. And a lot of PT school would only focus on muscles, and we would kind of talk about ligaments and tendons, but they didn't really talk about how we actually can change the ligaments and tendons, because of course we can. If we look at the human body, there's no glue. So when you have a muscle, That muscle then attaches to the tendon, which attaches to the ligament, right? There's no like point that we can draw in between a tendon and a muscle and be like, this part is muscle, this part is tendon. As a muscle starts to get closer to the tendon, there is a little bit more tendony stuff and a little less muscly stuff. And then when the tendon gets closer to the muscle, there's a little less tendony stuff and a little bit more muscle stuff. So the like actual cells and tissues, there's that word again, they start to look a little bit less like one thing and a little bit more like the other. And at some point, then they switch over and it's a continuum. So there's no like glue connecting those things. And when you actually dissect cadavers, you see this. It's really cool. But this was a concept, of course, that was really brought to my attention in functional range conditioning, the FRC seminar, and they do a really great job at explaining this. But when you are contracting a muscle or a group of muscle fibers, you are contracting all of the things that are attaching to those things. So there is forces being placed upon all of those things, not just one. We can't just only target the muscle. So this is also, this is pretty cool because that means that when you're strengthening all of the things, right? But it also means if you have an injury to something that's not a muscle, you can still change and have effect on said thing. So the first thing I wanted to cover is that your tissues means basically all of the connective tissue, and almost all of it, I think, we can make change in. We can communicate to it to become stronger or a little bit healthier. And I think that's pretty cool that we can do that, to be honest. The second thing I wanted to talk about is that a muscle is not even a single thing. So when I talk about tissues, right, and we talk about muscles, we just kind of think, okay, this exercise targets the quads, right? And we're just calling quads one thing. And when I learned it, that's what I learned. And there are all these beautiful anatomy drawings of quads and all of that. The thing that's really important to understand that I think they said in FRC too was that every anatomy picture or book that we see is art. It is an artist's understanding of what the human body looks like, but it's all art, and all of it's wrong, and some of it's a little bit less wrong. Like none of it's like perfect because we all have a little bit different anatomy. So I think they're really helpful. I love looking at all of the different pictures of anatomy, and I think it's important to look at that, but like understand that a muscle isn't a single thing. When we go to contract a muscle, for example, it's not like the whole muscle contracts. This is going to get a little nitty gritty. Ryan's going to start snoring here in a second, but we have a motor unit.
I was still breaking down quads. It's not one thing, it's four things.
Oh, that's true.
But let's break down each individual quad into now what Jen's going to talk about.
We are not short of dad jokes over here. Like that is not a problem or an issue in this area of the world.
I did ask one of my clients the other day how many muscles are in the quads, and he got it wrong.
Well, if you don't study, I would expect that. That's kind of...
It's four.
Yeah. Well, quad means four, like we would think that, but I don't know. Some of the things in the human body, the way it's named, you would think it means something, and then it's opposite, so I could understand people getting it wrong. But there are four different muscles that make up the quads. But in each muscle, like the vastus lateralis, it's not just one single muscle. So when you go to contract the vastus lateralis, you're not contracting this vastus lateralis. You are contracting some of that muscle or all of it and some of the other muscles. We just kind of delineate. We like draw arbitrary lines of like what a muscle is, kind of. So as a muscle gets closer to the muscle next to it, kind of like I was talking before, like it's kind of hard to see the delineations of what is what, and it's hard to determine which one is contracting versus which one is not. We cannot necessarily isolate like that. What we typically do when we contract is have a contraction of what we call a motor unit. So every muscle fiber, is that right? I'm gonna say that like we're gonna work on this together. Every muscle fiber is a group of muscle. No, every muscle fascicle is a group of muscle fibers, and within the motor neuron, it's a group of fibers. Correct?
Yes.
Okay. So what?
The motor neuron controls the group of fibers.
Of fibers, which is a fascicle.
Yes.
This is why anatomy is really fun. So basically you can have like, and pictures are really helpful when we look at this. You can kind of Google the structure of a skeletal muscle, but you'll have like a whole muscle, but there will be groups of muscle fibers, and a nerve is going to innervate groups of those things. So you can have some of those groups contract and not others, is essentially what we're saying. So, and you can have groups of like all of them contract. You can have some of them contract of one muscle and some of them contract in another muscle. But all you need to know is that when we go to move or contract something, there's like lines of tissue or forces that are dissipated or that are produced from the contraction of those. And it's not all of the entire muscle. The reason that I wanted to bring this up is because mainly, I think it's really interesting when we are doing training in the gym. If we are doing our pattern training, which is like our deadlifts or our squats, and we do the same variation forever and ever and ever, we are training the same lines of tissues over and over and over. But if we change how we're doing those, or maybe shift the variation of the squat we do, or we change and do some different variations of unilateral exercises like lunges, or change the way that we're doing our lunges, we might change which part of our muscle we're targeting a little bit more. So we might get a different group of muscle fibers that we're targeting versus the others. That is different. And that is like kind of why it's important to have some form of variability in your training and your strength training. So variability just means like, not that you should be doing something different every single time, but over years, doing the same exact thing, the same exact way, you're going to reach a peak at which some parts of your body, some of those tissues are going to be overtrained, and some of them are going to be undertrained, and there's going to be some that you're never developing, and both of those are going to be more at risk for injuries. So this is why it's really important to understand that like we're not just training a muscle group and variability matters in changing the way that you do some of your exercises.
So an example of variability, like I do step-ups, just like dumbbell step-ups onto a box. Jen had me the other day do some step-ups with some like hip internal rotation on the way up and then hip external rotation stuff on the way down, or what, I don't even know.
He was like rotating his pelvis a little bit. That's what I was having him do specifically.
But the stuff that I was feeling the next 2 days after was stuff that I have not trained in a long while.
Yes.
So it was good to have some variability there, and to continue training that for the next month or so will be good because it's something that I haven't necessarily done.
It's just an area or a line of tissues or a line of tension that's being generated on tissues that's telling those areas, those muscle fibers, those connective tissue, because now we're talking about tendons, a little bit of ligamentous stuff and fascial stuff in that area. All of those are things that maybe he wasn't ever targeting with a lot of load and force. So they're not, because of entropy, which is always around, always making us weaker if we're not working on combating it by trying to strengthen something. He probably wasn't targeting them in his exercise, and he knows that because he's never felt them like sore. But this is what I mean. So variability in fitness means changing the exercise that you do, so the types, so different variations of a deadlift, like an RDL, a traditional deadlift, a kettlebell deadlift, a B-stance deadlift, a single leg deadlift, different variations of it, names that we make up of movements, but also
1 1/4 rep.
Yeah, those are really fun. But also doing like different ways of doing the exercise. So maybe instead of being square with your hips, you rotate towards the leg a little bit, which has been something I've worked on a lot. Because it actually like mimics the gait cycle of when we're walking. We actually have some pelvis rotation, and so that's like working on controlling our pelvis, moving on our femur, which is basically what we do all day as walking adults. So things like that can completely change what you're targeting. Doing your deadlifts with a little bit of rotation or movement in different positions is also going to target different tissues. So if you're listening to this and you're like, okay, I'm going to go try all these weird movements, please understand that like if you're used to deadlifting a crap ton of weight and you've done it for a long time and then you all of a sudden try a different way of doing it, you should start at square one again, because now you're doing these tissues that have never been loaded. So you're going to basically put yourself at risk for an injury if you try to load them at this new max that you've achieved in the different position with loading a different line of tissues. So as soon as you shift a little bit, you're loading a little different line of tissues. So that's what I mean, and that's what we mean if we talk about like our tissues. When I there's like two other reasons that I kind of wanted to bring this up, and it really becomes important to understand that when we are like generating force through tissues or producing force or lines of tension in our tissues, it's communicating to those tissues, those cells, to do something. One of the things that FRC talks about a lot is the idea that force is the language of the cells. And the way that we communicate with our bodies isn't necessarily telling our body, hey, like quads, I want you to grow. Like I've tried that a lot. I've tried it with my biceps and it like doesn't work no matter how much I yell at them. I've tried soft talking. I've tried like politely convincing them. I've tried joking to them. I've tried indirectly talking to them. I've tried shouting at them, like whispering, like nothing that I tell them will make them grow. But if I train them to a point where they are failing, I am then communicating, hey, that was a really like high load. You basically failed and couldn't complete the last rep. Now my body's going to be like, well, we couldn't do that. We failed. It produced some damage. We're not only going to fix the damage, because you're kind of having some micro tears when you strength train. They're not just going to fix the damage. They're then going to fix it and make that area a little bit stronger and create a little bit more strength in that area, because our body is like, well, when I get up against this force again, I'm going to be better at it. I'm going to be better prepared. That's exercise 101 in like a gist, right? Like our body is just like goes through stress. We stress the body and our body is like, cool, I'm going to make these changes according to the stress that I achieved so I can be better at that stress the next time that it comes around in my body. And knowing this and understanding this is really cool, because we can manipulate now different parts of our body to make changes. And I think traditional fitness only use this for traditional fitness things like cardiorespiratory training or strength training, so we can build muscle mass or just be stronger and be able to lift or move more weight. But what a lot of rehab and mobility is doing is looking at this from a little bit of a different lens and saying, okay, well, we're not just building muscle mass and strength. What about one, all of the lines of tissue we're not training traditionally with the regular lifts that we're doing? And two, what if we like get real specific with where those forces are going through and target tendons or the directional preference of something that would target ligaments? Or what if we started thinking about the capsule of our joints, where the actual joint meets the actual bone meets the other bone and the deepest part of that? And what if we targeted that to make that a little bit more healthy? Because we know that as we get arthritis, that stuff, the actual like ligamentous capsular stuff that surrounds that joint, starts to get a little less flexible, a little more stiff, and a little more prone to injuries and pain. Things that we kind of know about arthritis. They're like some of the first signs of getting some degeneration at that joint. And what if we can target that earlier on, so then we're less likely to need to get a hip replacement down the road, because we can actually get those cells to change. And so something like this information and thinking about tissue remodeling, which is just communicating with our cells to lay healthier tissue down, new tissue, because guess what? Our body is constantly overturning the tissues in our body. Like the body you're in now is not the same one. I think there's only like a couple of types of tissue that are not constantly regenerating, but a lot of our body is constantly being turned over and our cells are being replaced with new cells. And those cells are going to be replaced with cells of the exact same type unless we give our body a reason to create healthier new better cells. So that's what exercise does. General exercise, however, is not going to target things like our hip joint because it's not specifically communicating to those cells. It might generally get it a little bit, but your squat is not always necessarily going to get you a better hip joint, especially if you don't have a good hip joint to start with. You're adding weight, and that's actually going to make you less likely to be able to communicate to your hip. Plus, if we're trying to talk to our hip capsule, if you Google it, it's very rotational. So like the fibers are rotational, and the muscles that kind of attach to those fibers are basically like a rotator cuff, but in our hip. So they are our rotational muscles. They are our muscles that rotate our hip. So this is why hip rotation is so important, because it's actually communicating to those deepest tissues that surround our hip joint, which is how we keep a nice, mobile, healthy hip. And if you have a nice, mobile, healthy hip, you're able to move your hip, you have more freedom, then it gets a little bit easier to do anything else and target anything else in your hip. You get a little more range of motion, you can get a little more strength, you can stretch those muscles a little bit more to actually get more hypertrophy if your goal is to do something like grow your glutes. But if you don't have a good healthy hip, it's gonna be harder because you're gonna hit a roadblock because the deepest part is really stiff and not super healthy. So when we talk about tissue remodeling, that's what we're talking about, is inducing force, communicating with our cells through their language, not yelling at them like I was talking about with my bicep, and getting those cells then to lay down healthier collagen or connective tissue, and in a direction that is where we want it. This becomes also important in the rehab process. So in rehab, when you've initially injured yourself, your body will start that process no matter what. So like you injure yourself, and what is the first thing that most people have been told about how to help themselves with an initial stage of rehab?
Rest, ice.
Yeah, rest, ice, compress, and elevate, right? So it's basically get rid of the inflammation as fast as possible. But recently we've known that like we don't necessarily want to get rid of the inflammation because it's actually helpful. It gets your body to bring a bunch of cells into the area, and with those cells comes a lot of fluid. But our body basically immediately starting the repair process. The problem with this is the cells that lay down collagen are called fibroblasts. They will lay down new connective tissue no matter what. They're going to put something over the injured tissue if you sprain your ankle or do something where you pull a muscle. If we do not communicate with those cells about how to lay that down, so if the cells are not told what direction to lay that collagen down, it's going to be laid down in kind of a mangled mess. And that is what scar tissue is. It's just, it lays it down haphazardly and just kind of rushes to get it in as best as it can. But if we start movement and we move in the ranges of motion that we have, that's actually communicating to those cells to lay healthy collagen down in that direction. So this is why understanding the tissue remodeling is really important, and understanding how we can affect change is really important, because in the very initial stage, the acute stage of rehab, we are able to get our bodies to not lay down a bunch of scar tissue. We don't want a lot of scar tissue in our body because it's less mobile, so it's less flexible. And if you have like an area, I'm trying to think of like how to describe this. If you have an area of something that's stretchy, but you have one spot on it that's like not stretchy, that's been like repaired, or it's like, I have no good analogy for this right now, but something that's like stuck, and you try to stretch it, the area that you're most likely to like rip or tear is going to be where the non-stretchy part attaches to the stretchy part. So if you have a scar tissue attached to healthy collagen, the area where that scar tissue isn't going to stretch, so then the area around it is going to have to compensate for that, or it's more stretchy, and so a lot of force is going to go through that area instead of being dissipated across the full area.
Yeah.
Does that make?
You could do the analogy of like a big circular monster band, and then tying like a tiny little TheraBand to it.
Yes.
And if you yank on that like thin tiny TheraBand a lot,
if you just yank on both of them, you just pull them both, then they're gonna stretch, right? But like the thing that's gonna stretch the most is gonna be
the weaker thing.
And if you really pull and give more force, which is most likely to tear?
The weaker thing.
the weaker thing, right? So that's kind of how that works, because the path of least resistance is always how energy flows. So that is why it's important to understand that. So if we can start affecting that, this is why the first thing we always tell people is do cars. Like if you injure your ankle, just do like a shit ton of cars all day long, in pain-free ranges of motion, because that's how we tell our cells to lay down the collagen in the area that we want, so that we have healthier tissue and don't have as much scar tissue, because scar tissue is not ideal, right? Scar tissue also can become more vascularized and more painful. So if we have a lot of scar tissue that's laid over years and years from chronic bouts of inflammation of something getting irritated, that is hard to change. By the way, connective tissue and the tissue remodeling isn't something that we're doing over days and weeks. It's like months and years, like think decades. That's like how long I want you to think about changing some of these collagen and connective tissues. The deeper the layer that we're working on, the longer it's going to take. So muscle can regenerate, or we can alter the tissue a little bit quicker, but something like your hip capsule is going to take quite a significantly longer time to affect change with. So in the rehab process, we're just trying to basically reduce how many long-term issues you can have from the initial injury. And then the second thing is, as we age, entropy is always there. So if you don't know entropy, it's the concept, the physics concept that says that everything in the universe tends towards disorder with time. So over time, things get more disorganized. Things like our house gets dirty just from living in it and being alive if we don't actively work to combat that, which means cleaning. Things like the yard. I'm going to bring up the yard because it's Ryan's nemesis right now. But the yard will get taken over by whatever is best at growing. And right now that's weeds. So if we don't actually actively combat entropy in our yard right now, weeds will take it over. And right now our yard looks pretty bare because Ryan is combating the weeds with a weed killer, and it's a large part of our yard. So we're slowly trying to get healthier grass up there, but entropy is always there. And so over time, our bodies are the same way. We get weaker, we get more frail, we get more stiff, we get more likely to be injured as we get older, right? Because entropy. It's very exhausting and energy costly for us to maintain healthy tissues. So our bodies take path of least resistance too, and that's what happens. This is why we do things like cars though, because cars is every single day communicating to your cells to lay healthier collagen down. It's as simple as that. It's warding off things like what we call fibrosis, which is the laying down of excessive collagen when we are having either after an injury. So that's laying down like that, scar tissue or fibrotic tissue. It's also things like if we have a significant amount of inflammation, those inflammatory molecules trigger this without movement especially. So if we do that rest thing that Ryan mentioned earlier, we are going to produce less healthy tissues as a byproduct when we get injured. And so over time, this is why we're doing cars. So if you've ever done cars and you're what am I really doing? You are helping with a little bit of tissue remodeling. If you are a little confused about what we mean when we're talking about lines of force, that's the next thing that I want to talk about, because it's not just a muscle contraction. It's also can be stretching. Anything that is force going through a cell is communicating it. So forces can be tensile, where we are stretching it. Forces can be compressive, where we are contracting it. We can have different kinds of forces. So when we are putting force on different parts or different tissues, we are communicating what we want through those. So if we are communicating that we want them to be a little bit more flexible and mobile, that's what stretching is doing. If we are communicating that we want stronger tissues or more healthy connective tissue, that is what contractions are doing. So if you have ever done isometrics, if you've ever done kin stretch, and we've done some of those Pales rails, and you're I feel like I'm working really hard, but I'm not really sure if I'm getting much out of it. part of what we're doing is trying to get strength. So trying to get you to contract well there and connect and get those motor units to contract those specific muscle fibers that are connected to those motor units. But the other part is also we use Pale's rails to communicate to the tissues that are along those lines of tension that happen when you contract. So like if you're working on hip internal rotation, we're really communicating to your hip capsule to lay a healthier collagen in that area, especially if we're not working on like that max intensity. We're kind of at that lower intensity, longer duration. That is just communicating to our cells to lay healthier collagen down. And that's kind of what we are talking about when we say connective tissue. I mean, not even connective tissue. When we say tissue, like regeneration or remodeling, it's just communicating to lay a better version of the tissues in the future. And it's not like you can do one round of this and it's done. Like how many times do people feel like that? I feel like a lot.
Yeah, all the time.
But what I feel like we like to remind people that you can't just like grow biceps doing bicep curls one time unless you're Ryan. Oh. I feel like Ryan looks at a dumbbell, thinks about doing bicep curls, and he gets a bicep pump. And then I like do every type of bicep curl and I yell at my biceps and like nothing happens, but my forearm grows. Like it doesn't make any sense. But when we think about changing our bodies, whether it's internal, like something that we can't see, or whether it's external, like growing our biceps or our glutes, it doesn't happen very shortly. And it's a lot of repetition, and it's showing up and consistently communicating to our body. And it's also making sure that it's at an intensity that's going to generate the adaptations we want. So I feel like it's really important to understand both of those things when it comes to like actually changing connective tissue, like your cars. It's not like one time doing your cars is going to make you have this healthy joint. It's how many freaking reps, like thousands? It's a lot. And sometimes I think about like how many reps we've done over the years since we've like learned about cars. And it's actually kind of cool to know that as I've gotten older over the past 5 years now, probably even more, that we've learned cars.
We're aging in reverse.
We've gotten better. Like our joints have gotten more mobile, less painful, and like overall improved versus what they would have expected. Now, I can hear like half of the population, because this is what happens on social media all the time, saying, well, you were at your prime time and wait until you hit X. Like whatever. I will wait until I hit X, and I will still continue working on my mobility, because I think that just assuming that I'm going to disintegrate is not how I would like to live my life. I would like to at least try and mitigate as much as I can, and then just assume it's all going to be terrible. And nobody that has told me that has ever done cars for decades and has not worked on their mobility consistently. And I don't even think they've really done a lot of exercise consistently. So make sure if you ever hear somebody say that, you just ask them what kinds of things that they've done, so you can make sure that you're doing other things, because their experience isn't going to be yours, or it doesn't have to be. But yeah, hopefully this gives you a little bit better understanding of tissue remodeling, like the most boring thing ever. Ryan's already asleep. He's literally staring off right now. Like this was the most boring podcast episode ever. The first part was really great, and then I talked, and now everybody's sleeping.
They wanted a nap.
I know.
They asked for this because they're like, I need something to fall asleep to at night.
I hope you don't fall asleep to my voice. But I think that I wanted to bring this up too, because it just highlights how like most of the things that we experience injury wise are not as permanent as we think. So I think that's like one of my favorite things of talking to people. Some of the people I work with, they're like a little bit more fearful, and I wouldn't say hypochondriac, but like they get an injury and they're like, oh my gosh, like this is terrible. Like, can I even fix that? And most of the time we can either affect change and like change the actual, so like if I tell somebody their hip internal rotation is not very great, they're like, can I even change that? I'm like, of course you can. So most of the time we can change the things that are limitations. And if we can't change them, we can work really, really hard to not need to change them. What I mean is our body is really good at not always needing a super healthy cartilage, for example. Like if you tear cartilage in your knee, sometimes you can't regenerate that or fix it. But sometimes we need to kind of understand that cartilage is like a last case resort. So like That's supposed to be a shock absorber after we have failed to absorb shock from our muscles. The actual main shock absorbers in our body is our muscles. It's our muscles and it's our fascia that like kind of dissipate energy through our body. So that is what I like to think about when we think about tissue remodeling, is just that we can actually change a lot of things. And if we can't change and directly affect the injury, we can definitely directly affect how much it affects the rest of our lives. And like even ligaments, like we have research now to show that like our ACL thickens with resistance training, specifically with things like kettlebell swings. So that's really cool to see that and know that like things that we used to think we couldn't have an effect on, we totally can now, and you probably already are. So like basic strength training is the very beginning of starting to affect and strengthen your ligaments and tendons. But mobility training really helps to fill in the gaps that hopefully you can kind of see a little bit that are highlighted here that we aren't necessarily getting with traditional lifts. And really it just starts with cars. But I think it highlights some of the gaps that fitness has and a little bit of where like understanding this concept can apply. And hopefully you can see how this concept in mobility training isn't just doing hip internal rotation pails rails only. It also is changing the lens through which we look at general fitness and lifts, and maybe not just doing traditional RDLs forever and ever and ever, and maybe playing around with B stance and rotating our pelvises a little bit, and maybe playing around with, if you do knee extensions, like rotating your tibia in and out at different angles slightly, because you're gonna challenge different parts of your quads and different muscle fibers in each of those different angles, and now you can get a little bit more out of it. And if you've ever plateaued in your fitness, this is a great way to kind of like play around with other things too. A lot of people will reach plateau because they're doing the same thing over and over and over again, and we just need to make things work better and target things that fitness doesn't. The other thing that I think this doesn't is highlight the lack of not understanding, but fitness is so superficial. We're so focused on aesthetics. Even when we're not, we are. Like, we're focused on either like what we look like, maybe like putting muscle mass on, or we're focused on still external things like being good at a deadlift or being strong at a deadlift, rather than being strong in our bodies and working at things from like an inside out perspective and really getting our hip ball and socket joints to rotate like a ball and socket joint. So I love that FRC did this for a lot for me, and like really kind of took a lot of this stuff I learned in DPT school. Ryan learned this in Cairo school too, I think. He was asleep for probably part of it. Just kidding.
No, I only like slept during classes that I was like, I am not gonna use dermatology or stuff like that.
I'm trying to think of some of the other classes that you hated. But...
Oh, we had an online pharmacology class.
Oh yeah, pharmacology was terrible. Just like straight memorizing. That's like not fun. This stuff is kind of memorizing, but then application, so it's kind of cool. But I think that it's just cool to see how these types of concepts highlight the gaps in fitness, and then understanding and then applying these concepts can really fill in the gaps. And for a lot of people who are struggling, like this gives them a lot of hope, a lot more things to work on. It's pretty fucking cool. I think it is. This was the secret sauce for me that I was looking for forever, because there were so many things in my body I didn't understand. And once I started to really get these concepts, it really helped me connect with my body better. And then now through all the Kinstretch work and application of this, all of my lifts feel so much better. And then I can get more out of my lifts because I can own my movement versus the movement owning me. And I think it's really cool to look at fitness from a lens of like inside out and really getting better at our bodies rather than just getting better at fitness for the sake of fitness. So yeah, anything you want to add from that?
This is a beautiful podcast.
You see why I married this guy?
Great.
He's so nice. Okay, so we are finished with the episode. If you are not subscribed, I would recommend hitting that subscribe button, get the notification when we launch a new podcast every single Friday. If you have already reviewed our podcast, thank you so much. We are always going to remind you that if you haven't, please just go take a couple seconds, hit that 5-star review, and just drop a note so somebody can know about how amazing these boring podcasts can be. And maybe this is information that will kind of change somebody's life when it comes to understanding fitness and movement and rehab and injuries. And I think it might be worth it. So if you do that, thank you. I appreciate you. And thank you, Dr. Ryan, for joining us. I appreciate you and all of your bantering.
Maybe I'll catch you on the next episode.
Maybe, but I definitely will. So we'll see you in the next episode.